Good evening, and thank you for joining us today. I'm here to announce to all my fellow Americans that Julius and Anthony Rosenberg have been executed yesterday, June 19, 1953. The American couple have been persecuted and captured in the 1950s and have been accused of conspiracy and commit espionage. Especially, they were accused of heading a spy ring that passed top secret information concerning the atomic bomb to the Soviet Union. During the next 2 years, the couple became the subject of both national and international debate. Many people believe that Roosevelt were the victims of the surge of hysterical anti-communist feeling in the United States, and processed the death sentence handed down was cruel and unusual punishment. Most Americans, however, believe that the Roosevelt had been dealt with justly. President Dwight Eisenhower spoke for many Americans when he issued a statement declined to evoke excessive symmetry for the pair. Eisenhower stated, "I can only say that by unmeasurably increasing the chance of an atomic war, the Rosenbergs may have condemned to death tens of millions of innocent people all over the world. The execution of two human beings is a grave matter, but even greater is the thought of millions of deaths, those deaths may have been directly attributed to those spies have done." Julius Rosenberg was the first to be executed at about 8 p.m. on June 9, 1953, just a few minutes after his body was removed from the chamber containing the electric chair. Ethel Roosevelt was led and strapped in the same chair. She was pronounced dead at 8:16 p.m. Both refused to admit any wrongdoing and proclaimed their innocent right. Moving on, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the decisive engagement in the First Indochina War, it consisted of a struggle between French and Vietnamese communist and nationalist forces for control of a small mountain outpost on the Vietnamese border near Laos. The Viet Minh victory in this battle effectively ended the 8-year-old war. The battle was joined in the late 1953 when French forces, who had been rapidly losing ground to their popularly supported Viet Minh, occupied the town of Dien Bien Phu in an attempt to cut the nationalist supply lines into Laos to maintain a base for forays against enemy forces. Although the Vietnamese quickly cut all the roads into Dien Bien Phu, making it supplemental only by air, the French were confident of their position. They were thus taken by surprise when the Viet Minh Gen Vo Nguyen Giap surrounded the base with 40,000 men and used heavy artillery to break the French lines. Despite heavy U.S. aid, the base was overrun, and I'm here to tell you today, May 7, 1954, the French retreated. Moving on, October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union successfully launched Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite. The spacecraft, named Sputnik after the Russian word for satellite, was launched at 10:29 p.m. Moscow time from the Tyuratam launch base in the Kazakhstan Republic. Sputnik has a diameter of 22 inches and weighed around 184 pounds, and circles the Earth once every hour and 36 minutes, constantly traveling at 18,000 miles an hour. Its elliptical orbit has an apogee, the farthest point from Earth, of 584 miles, and a perigee, nearest point, of 143 miles. Visible with binoculars before sunrise and after sunset, Sputnik transmits radio signals back to Earth strong enough to be picked up by amateur radio operators. The Sputnik launch has changed everything. Officially, Sputnik has launched to correspond with the International Geophysics Year, a solar period that the International Council of Scientific Union declared that will be ideal for launching artificial satellites to study Earth and solar system. However, many Americans feared more sinister uses of the Soviet New York rocket and satellite technologies, which was apparently strides ahead of the U.S. space effort. Sputnik is 10 times the size of the first planned U.S. satellite, which is not scheduled to be launched until next year. The U.S. government, military, and scientific community were caught off guard by the Soviet technological achievement, and their united efforts to catch up with the Soviets had heralded the beginning of the space race. As a technical achievement, Sputnik has caught the world's attention and the American public off guard. The public now fears that the Soviet ability to launch satellites also translates to the capability to launch ballistic missiles that could carry nuclear weapons from Europe to the United States. So what will the U.S. do now that our communist rivals have this technology?
Thank you, Steve. Last week, March 1st, 1961, President John F. Kennedy issued an executive order, number 1092-4, establishing the Peace Corps as a new agency within the Department of State. The same day, he sent a message to Congress asking for permanent funding for the agency, which will send trained American men and women to foreign nations to assist in developmental efforts. The Peace Corps have captured the imagination of the U.S. public, and during the week after its creation, thousands of letters have poured into Washington from young Americans hoping to volunteer. The immediate prosecutor of the Peace Corps, the Point Four Youth Corps, was proposed by Representative Henry Roos of Wisconsin in the late 1950s. Senator Kennedy learned of the Roos proposal during his 1960 presidential campaign and, sensing growing public enthusiasm for the idea, decided to add it to his platform. In early October in 1960s, he sent a message to young Democrats that called for the establishment of a Young Peace Corps. And on October 14th, he publicly spoke of the Peace Corps idea at an early morning speech at University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The night before, he had engaged Vice President Richard Nixon in the third presidential debate and was surprised to find an estimate of 10,000 students waiting to hear him speak when he arrived at the university at 2 a.m. The assembled students heard a future president issue a challenge. How many of them, he asked, would be willing to serve for their country and the cause of freedom by living and working in developing world for years at a time? The Peace Corps proposal gained momentum in the final days of Kennedy's campaign, and November 8th, he was narrowly elected to the 35th President of the United States. On January 20th, 1961, his famous inauguration address, he promised to aid the poor of the world. Quote, "To those people in huts and villages of half the globe struggling to break the bonds of mass misery," he said, "we pledge our best efforts to help them help themselves for whatever period is required, not because communists may be doing it, but because we seek their votes, but because it is right." He also appealed to Americans to ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Moving on, as we know, 4 years ago in 1957, the Soviet Union launched the satellite Sputnik, and the space race was on. The Soviets' triumph jarred the American people and sparked a rigorous response in the federal government to make sure the United States did not fall behind its communist rival. Now, in 1961, the nation is suffering yet another shock as Soviet Communist Yuri Gagarin became the first man to orbit the Earth. The United States, it seems, is falling behind. On May 25th, 1961, President John F. Kennedy just announced before a special joint session of Congress the dramatic and ambitious goal of sending Americans safely to the moon before the end of the decade. Kennedy is feeling great pressure to have the United States catch up and take over the Soviet Union in the space race. Yuri Gagarin had become the first human in space on April 12, 1961, and greatly embarrassed the United States. While Alan Shepard was the first American in space on May 5th, he only flew a short suborbital flight instead of orbiting the Earth, as Gagarin had done. Kennedy wanted to announce a program that the U.S. had a strong chance at achieving before the Soviet Union. After consulting with Vice President Johnson, NASA Administrator John Webbs, and other officials, he concluded that landing on an American on the moon would be a very challenging technological feat, but an area of space exploration in which the U.S. actually had a potential lead. The potential project is set to codename Apollo 11 and will be conducted by NASA, the National Aeronautics Space Administration. On tonight's last story, when the Allies in 1945 defeated the German Reich, it was divided into 4 zones. Berlin was divided into 4 sections which were under the joint administration of the 4 powers, the UK, France, the US, and USSR. The Soviets wanted total control of the administered zone and worked towards the total control of the entire country. The Cold War is bringing tension over Berlin again. For East Germans dissatisfied with life under Communist City, the West Berlin was a gateway to democratic West. Between 1949 and 1961, some 2.5 million East Germans fled from East to West Germany, mostly via West Berlin. By August 1961, an average of 2,000 East Germans are crossing into the West every day. Many of the refugees are skilled laborers, professionals, and intellectuals, and their loss was having a devastating effect on the East German economy. To halt the expedition to the West, Soviet leader Nikita recommended to East Germany that it close off access between East and West Berlin. At midnight, August 13, 1961, East Germany's police and army began to close the Berlin border. This was completed by morning. The East Germans' government forces then began to demolish the streets along the border, making it impassable to vehicles. Starting August 17, 1961, construction on the wall made a large concrete blocks again. Now during construction, these crucial hours of construction, army units are being deployed in the front of the construction with instruction to shoot anyone attempting to cross. We can only assume that the intention behind this wall was to stop immigrants from East and West Germany. While that can only be assumed, it is a known fact that the construction of this wall will completely and undeniably change the war. Whether that is a good or bad change is up to fate now.
Thank you for watching. It's been Steve.
And George.
Thank you.
This program was made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.